Hi, my name is Jamie Spruce Clifton, and this is my theory and practice project for the course Reading Comprehension in the Content Areas at East Central University. In this project, I previously identified the 10 best practices for teaching reading and writing in content areas for diverse learners. I then selected 3 of the 10 best practices, which I would then put into the areas I selected were activating prior knowledge, summarizing the material, and applying reinforcements. Activating prior knowledge works as a preview to the reading that piques interest and also has background knowledge activated so associations can then be made between older known information with the new material. Summarizing the material has students identify the main idea from the reading to confirm their understanding of information. Readers are made aware of what they are reading, which then aids in conceptual understanding. Applying reinforcement can be done in a number of ways. The interactive websites allow students to further expand or confirm their comprehension of the material by instead seeking or working with visual examples. Wrap-up questions gives a chance for students to self-monitor the reading and to apply metacognitive strategies. I do not have a class of my own since I'm not yet an in-service teacher. However, I am fortunate enough to be acquainted with my children's school fairly well and know several of the teachers personally. One teacher allowed me to use her class to present a lesson I developed for this theory and practice project. Since I wanted to simulate a lesson where students have already done a review of the upcoming vocabulary words but did not have the time allowed to actually do it in my lesson, I decided to go with a lesson they had once covered. I decided to develop and cover a lesson in science for my own sake of enjoying the subject matter. Their textbook is a science book published by Harcourt School Publishers. As you can see here, it is the 5th grade edition with a jaguar on the front cover. This book comes in a series, and the one in which my lesson came out of is Unit C, Processes That Change Earth. I decided to cover Lesson 3, How Do Movements of the Crust Change the Earth? This lesson covers the Earth's structure in regard to plates, then earthquakes, volcanoes, and mountain formations. In my lesson, I wanted to see if I could garner more comprehension than they had gotten on their own through self-reading. So again, the 3 strategies I selected from the top 10 strategies previously identified were activating background knowledge, summarizing the material, and reinforcement. Activating knowledge would be done by using the KWL chart, the summarizing by using a worksheet called Getting the Gist, and then reinforcement would happen by using interactive websites and conducting wrap-up questions. I had 50 minutes to cover the material and no further attempts would be available. I began the lesson by explaining to the class what page we would begin on as I handed out the KWL chart. I instructed the students to write in the first column, labeled K, what they knew about the topic listed on the rows to the left. They were a little apprehensive at first because they were unfamiliar with the KWL chart. It was apparent they feared getting an answer wrong, so I assured them there was not a wrong answer per se, that it was solely based on what they happened to know on the topics listed in the chart. I then did a short example of the first item, Earth structure. The students then began to quietly and quickly write their answers down. I then instructed them to now open their books to the page we were starting on and to just quickly skim through, such as reading the headings, looking at the pictures, or reading the picture captions, or take note of the vocabulary words. Then I instructed them to think about what they might want to know more about and write it on the column labeled W. After a few of the students were finished with the second column, I began to pass out the worksheet Getting the Gist. Once they were all up to the KWL chart stop point, I explained that we would be reading the lesson together as a class, and as we read, we would stop periodically to summarize what we had just read and then write it down on the lines. I should note that I previously sat and read the lesson myself and sectioned off paragraphs which I thought would make summarizing more effective. A selected volunteer student read a passage, and upon the conclusion of her reading, I then instructed them to summarize in a sentence, somewhere around 10 or 15 words, what the paragraph was trying to tell us. This is where the class and I began to struggle. I had not realized beforehand that there were several students not at all comfortable with writing. I probably could have planned this part of the lesson much better to provide better examples of using the GIST worksheet. I thought maybe an example summary would help get them started, so I asked a few students to provide what they came up with. About 4 students raised their hands and provided a little different take. The problem with this, though, was that the other students wanted a repeat of what was said so they could write it down verbatim. It then turned into not what each individual student were comprehending from the reading, but what the other more vocal students were comprehending. However, after a little bit of time, I managed to figure out a better method that worked. I instead started calling on students to say a key word they thought was more important than the other words in the passage we had just read. Each time I had about 5 to 6 students adding a key word. After they said key words, I then instructed the student to then use those key words in a sentence, a summary sentence. It seemed after this, by noting heads down or the movement of pencils directly after reading passages, that this was sufficient example for the other students to get started on their GIST worksheets independently at the end of each passage, instead of them waiting on responses from the class. Eventually, we worked into a selected student reading a passage and students writing in summaries on their GIST worksheets without further keywords or examples being given. They began to pick out keywords on their own. I really wanted to use additional interactive resources I had located when I developed the lesson. However, because we as a class struggled so much on summarizing for the GIST worksheet, we used up a majority of the time allotted. I only had about 5 minutes left to finish out the lesson, so I instead opted to move into wrapping up. This is where I asked several questions that had them comparing and contrasting the information they had just read about. After we covered this portion, I then had the students complete the last column of their KWL chart. I indicated to the students they may be able to use what they had on their GIST worksheet to answer the final column on their KWL chart. The students then wrote in what they had learned on the KWL chart. I took up the papers for my evaluation and then asked them what they thought about the lesson. Many students enjoyed it, saying they didn't remember reading about some of the stuff the first time they covered it. Some students said they thought the writing was hard, but they felt like they finally got it at the end. Overall, the students said they felt like they learned more than the first time they had read the lesson. Both the KWL chart and the GIST worksheet went well once the students understood how and why they were doing the strategies. I think they were really effective tools for comprehension. Also, the teacher said that she had never seen her class all follow along so well during class readings, and said she may start using either one of the worksheets or both worksheets to keep the students on point and following along with the class. Obviously, the students' comfort level with summarizing and writing really held up the lesson and created a shortage of time to cover the other strategies I had in mind. I think we managed to recover quickly enough, however, so that the entire lesson was not lost. I'm certain, though, that once students have some practice with using either the KWL or GIST strategies, they will become comfortable enough to just fly through the worksheets independently. I had just haphazardly gone into using the strategies without realizing or planning for the things that could go wrong. I think this lesson was appropriate for science, especially if I had been able to use the interactive website. I was pleased that it brought out comprehension and attention to material that neither the students or the teacher had quite seen the first time the material was covered. Activating background knowledge seemed to have had the students' interest piqued and them open to learning more. The summarizing had students staying more aware of what they were reading. These two alone seemed to have had a significant impact on that comprehension. The student reaction was overall good. Some were uncomfortable with the writing, but with additional encouragement and examples they settled into it. I don't think changes to the lesson needed to happen with the format because I didn't see an apparent issue with it. The GIST worksheet could use better labeling such as letters or numbers. I could have had them indicated on the worksheet or board what passages could have been summarized on what line. There were a few changes I could have made in presentation. Delivery of GIST instruction and examples were worked out in the middle of the lesson, from giving summarized examples to giving only keywords and letting the students summarize. The other changes I would make were in the delivery of my presentation, since it was absent of using much technology. I probably could have been more effective had I used the whiteboard and wrote keywords or examples answers for them to see on either of the worksheets. I'd only anticipated to use the whiteboard for the interactive sites. This is the conclusion of my Theory and Practice project, and I appreciate you tuning in to review the information I put together. Have a good day.